Hi, everyone. It's noon, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm Lynn Richards. I'm the president and CEO of the Congress for the New Urbanism, and I want to welcome you all to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by CNU. We wanted to start an interactive webinar to provide a platform for members to kind of engage, discuss, debate, and share strategies as we all navigate this new world order, otherwise known as COVID. A lot of questions have come up from members. What does this mean for new urbanism? What does this mean for aging in place, for communities, as well as what are strategies for virtual engagement? What are lessons that we learned during the last recession that we want to talk about now? What are some approaches for local government? So we'll be doing this informal webinar every Tuesday for the next several weeks / months. So if you have any ideas that you want to hear about, if you yourself want to speak, you want to hear from other members, go ahead and shoot us an email and we'll try to get this, try to get it lined up. The recordings for the webinar will be posted online within 24 hours. So if you missed us today, go ahead and you can review it. So today, we're going to be talking about new urbanism for a new world. Joining us is Laurie, Volk, Seth, and Mike Lydon, Ashleigh, Walton. We'll be discussing their perspectives on how new urbanism is changing or not in the pandemic. Most of you know Laurie Volk. She is the founding co-manager director of Zimmerman, Volk and Associates, and is in charge of their market studies and the firm's primary analyst of demographic, market, and lifestyle trends. Seth is an architect. Seth is an architect, urban designer, and development consultant with over 35 years of experience with a focus on retail and mixed-use development. Mike loves cities and is also a principal at Street Plans and leads the team's New York office. And Ashleigh is an architect, urban designer, project manager at Urban Design Associates in Pittsburgh, owner of a new condo and a lovely dog. So each speaker is going to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. The way to ask questions is to go to the bottom of your screen and there's a Q&A button. So please send in your message through that, the Q&A button. All panelists will be able to see it. When we move to Q&A, I'll be moderating that. So I guess we're just going to go ahead and get started. So Laurie, you are first up, and welcome everybody. And thank you so much for joining us on our inaugural webinar. Laurie?
Great. Thank you so much, Lynn. I really appreciate being asked to participate in the very first park bench that CNU has held. I guess the big question for us is whether cities can survive the coronavirus. So we're not just worried about ourselves and whether we can survive, but whether the places that we love can survive going through what we've been going through for the past month or so. Certainly, the coronavirus pandemic has made density a bad word again. At the beginning of our movement, back in the early 90s, we didn't dare speak that word density because it always created a very negative reaction from the audience because all they could think of was traffic congestion and all the bad things about density. However, we learned over time that if you have sufficient density, you can also have the type of places that you really love. Places that have restaurants, that have coffee shops, that have stores. And people decided that they really love that. Density allows for walkability. However, the popular press has been positing a lot of theories about what coronavirus is going to do to our cities and whether we will choose to live in cities. We believe that the physical distancing that is imperative now to reduce the impact of the pandemic is not going to, in the long run, alter settlement patterns in any significant way. A lot of the articles are just silly, but be that as it may, they're out there and we all have to contend with them. We all have to contend with our clients calling up and saying, what's going to happen? Will we be able to survive? In one respect, what happened after September 11th is probably a reasonable analogy. We had conducted a downtown study for Baltimore, and about a month after 9/11, I was asked to come make a presentation of our findings. And I made the presentation, and then there was Q&A, and the attendees were a mix of developers and residents and city people. And a developer raised his hand and said, will people ever want to live in a high-rise again? I was a bit taken aback by that question, but I thought to myself, and I said, yes, and it's going to happen a lot sooner than you think. And of course, with the reurbanization of cities since then, what has happened that in Manhattan, we have needle towers where units are selling for, up until a couple months ago, $100 million or more. So clearly the shock of something like 9/11, the shock of the physical distancing that we have to go through in order to try to lessen this disease is something that's going to have an impact. But I do not think deep down it's going to change the way we want to live. Human beings are social animals. And I do believe that the creation of neighborhoods, the support of neighborhoods that we have helped happen over the past 20 years has been critical to us being able to survive this period of our lives. The question over the relatively short term is how deep and how long is the downturn going to be? And what will that post-recession landscape look like? One of the big questions that we're going to be facing, how many of those restaurants that we love, how many of those cafes that we go to will still exist? Will they ever be able to return? Because those are some of the most important destinations that make a neighborhood walkable. From our perspective, we believe that the trend away from home ownership, away from any kind of ownership is going to, continue. The millennial generation, other than Ashleigh, continues to lag predecessor generations in home ownership. And we expect that to continue. And considering that in a few months, the leading edge of iGen, the next generation after the millennials, will be graduating from college and trying to enter the job market. That job market is potentially even worse than the one that the millennials faced when they reached that same stage in their life. From the housing perspective, with what we know currently, ZVA doesn't anticipate a long-term change in market support for walkable neighborhoods. However, the operative word in that statement is the word currently. We can't know, as once was said, the unknown unknowns. But our counsel to our clients has been to continue to plan buildings and projects now for market entry during the recovery. And we hope that that recovery will be in the not too distant future rather than several years from now. During the housing downturn and the recovering, we expect that rental housing should be relatively strong. We've been meeting over the phone and over Zoom and over all kinds of digital formats with multiple clients over the past several weeks. And we've learned that investment capital currently is still favoring rental housing and industrial uses over commercial, retail, and hospitality uses, which are the most affected by the measures to control the pandemic. And clearly, those commercial uses are ones that are so critical to our walkable neighborhoods. And Seth Harry, who is going to follow me, will be discussing that at length. We do know that the nation and the world is going to be a very different place after the plague has passed and the economy begins to grow again. We just don't know how different it's going to be and how different it will be from where it was just 3 short months ago. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Laurie. And I'd like to kind of build on a couple of the comments that you made regarding the commercial component of this. And I'm joining you from the city of Frederick, Maryland, which is a mid-sized city on the periphery of the greater Baltimore, Washington metro area. And your question really gets to the heart of how adaptable and resilient potentially urban retail is, or at least certainly in terms of compact walkable mixed-use neighborhoods relative to their suburban counterparts. Because of where I'm located in proximity to Washington, D.C., I have access to both urban and suburban neighborhoods that are statistically and demographically almost identical, with the exception of urban form. So I've been taking advantage of that to do sort of kind of an informal comparative analysis between the two. We also have a number of urbanist neighborhoods in the area, which I've also looked into and checked up on. I'm sort of kind of framing my discussion in terms of some of the common assumptions and perceptions about retail and urban form, and how my observations have addressed that. The first one is suburbia, by definition, is more dispersed and therefore safer than high-density urbanized areas relative to the potential for exposure to the virus, and in particular in terms of securing daily needs consumer goods. Based on my observations the last couple of days, I don't agree with that. Consumer businesses are by nature statistically driven and transaction-based, and suburban transactions, again, for those basic consumer goods are comparable in both urban and suburban areas. So in general, suburbia tends to have a higher percentage of national chains, including large national and extra-regional grocery chains and large discount department stores. And downtown Frederick, on the other hand, tends to have more smaller independent retailers, and then also a higher percentage of food and beverage operations. But in looking at the grocery stores specifically, I found them all to be struggling both in the urban neighborhoods as well as in the suburban neighborhoods in terms of coming to grips with this virus and the change in demand and keeping up with new safety measures. In making sort of my comparative analysis, I visited 3 local grocery stores. One of them, the small regional chain we typically frequent, which I think was doing a very good job in terms of managing inventory and worker safety, both worker and customer safety, and a larger extra-regional chain, grocery chain that more or less matched the smaller local store in terms of its response, and then also one large national retailer, discount retailer, who offered a curbside pickup, which of course they all did as well too. But I tried that specifically in online order to see how that worked. Interestingly enough, it took me 3 tries to find one that would actually allow me to schedule pickup. And when I made my order at that time, when I went to pick it up, 80% of the items that I had ordered were actually no longer available by the time of my pickup. So of the 3 options, the online order was actually the least successful in terms of meeting my needs. The second assumption that I explored was the notion that suburban retailers tend to rely on retail formats and business models, i.e. drive-through windows and big box stores with delivery and curbside pickup, that theoretically allow for a more efficient and robust and lower risk way to distribute critical goods and services. In general, my observations, all of the businesses appeared to be heavily impacted by the virus. For full service restaurants, the city of Frederick immediately implemented dedicated curbside parking for online ordering and curbside pickup, as well as delivery, matching the similar efforts in the suburban areas. And the reduction in daytime office workers may have impacted their business somewhat. That was also offset to a certain degree by residents living in the downtown that were no longer commuting to jobs in closer to DC. Suburban chains with drive-through restaurants did initially appear to be doing well, but that traffic seems to have dissipated over the past 2 weeks as, again, they're struggling to kind of come to terms with the larger and long-term impacts of the fires. Moving on to grocery stores, one of the reasons why, and suburban sit-down restaurants without drive-throughs appear to be similarly impacted to the downtown restaurants. Looking at grocery stores, one of the reasons why the grocery stores are dealing with such unprecedented demand is that up until fairly recently, 50% of consumer expenditures for food and beverage was actually outside of the home, and obviously a lot of that demand has shifted to in-home dining, and with the resulting uptick in grocery sales. It's debatable at this point, I think, in terms of who's doing a better job. Based on what I've been seeing, I think most of the grocery stores are still being frequented by customers going into the store, and the online fulfillment centers for online ordering has struggled, with many workers concerned about their own personal safety, as well as being one sick worker away from a large-scale contamination event. In fact, Amazon is closing a number of its warehouses right now as a result of that. And third-party grocery shoppers like Instacart are actually were threatening to strike. I believe they have today, in fact. So when we looked at the real economy, one question is which matters more? 70% of the U.S. economy is consumer-driven, and the middle class is the biggest driver of that consumer economy. But with the income of so many workers threatened, any immediate impact from the virus will likely be compounded many times over in knock-on effects to local economies. So that's clearly a concern. National and large chain retailers tend to be better capitalized and resourced to survive short-term disruptions to the market, but smaller locally owned independent merchants typically contribute a larger share of their gross income to their local communities, typically about 2 to 3 times as much, and they obviously have a stronger tie to the community and more motivation to stay, particularly if chains consolidate in response to the current events to protect stockholders, is what happened in the 2008 financial crisis. Given that, I think it's critical for cities and mainstream communities to provide coordinated local funding and support initiatives in addition to rent relief, similar to what towns like Erie, Pennsylvania has done to help small businesses weather this crisis, as well documented in a recent article by Bruce Katz. So then the next question is, what does it all mean in terms of placemaking and urban form? It's too early to tell what the long-term outcomes of this event will be, but clearly it's going to change many of the ways that we look at things moving forward. In terms of retail, I would say there's probably 2 likely extreme outcomes, which would be either we go to hyper-local, think London during the Blitz, or basically sourcing everything within our local regional economies, or relinquishing even more market share to large players like Walmart and Amazon until they become, in effect, too big to fail quasi-public utilities that must be supported at all costs. What I'm seeing in my observations is probably something of a combination of the 2. And some of the current trends, for instance, regarding ghost kitchens and grocery stores, probably becoming even more predominant, but possibly not, depending upon which way that goes. So the general assumption has been that suburban chains and boxes may provide a more robust and secure option, but early indications seem to suggest that might not be true in terms of providing a more, for instance, in terms of providing a more sterile consumer interface. I like to think of the large warehouse stores production distribution model more like an hourglass, in the sense that you have this very diffuse and far-reaching production and distribution chain, and on the other end you've got a very diffuse and dispersed consumer network, and they both come together at a point. So in terms of the actual interface and the security of that interface, it's debatable as to which one is actually more secure and safe from the consumer point of view. And while small businesses may be more vulnerable on an individual basis, they tend to offer more redundancy at a systemic level. So if at the transactional level, there's very little to differentiate small independent businesses in a more walkable urban setting and the number of people one must interface with in terms of those daily transactions and the dollars involved. The bigger question, I believe, is which one will be more socially gratifying and which one does a better job of supporting the community as a whole. And I think I agree with Laurie very much in the sense that I think that the general long-term trends towards more urban living is going to remain viable and a growing option. And I believe that with the support of the local communities, that locally serving retail goods and services can be supported. And then to talk about that a little bit more, next up is Mike Lydon.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to share my screen here real quick and drop into some slides, which I'm hoping you can all see. So I'm in Brooklyn, New York. This image that you see on the screen is my neighborhood. This is a block from our house. Clearly, we are in the thick of the worst of the early, phases here of the pandemic. So I have a kind of an interesting perspective and an interesting experience that I've been living through for the past 2 to 3 weeks here. New York City obviously is a very different place without people, without the density, without the traffic, without the activity, without our public life being as robust as it normally is, day to day, week to week. It's been really interesting. It's been scary. There's been lessons learned, I think, for lots of people on an individual level, also as a city, in thinking through how New York copes with this next wave challenge to its resiliency. And so I've lived here now for 10 years, and the last time we went through this was Sandy in 2012. I can tell you there's something very common or something that's very interesting about this that's related to that event, which is that New Yorkers are really pulling together insofar that we still have to remain pretty far apart. The spirit still remains pretty high here in the city from where I'm sitting. But this is also a very different type of event in the sense that, Sandy recovery basically started on day 2. And we're now in week 3 of this and probably 3, 6, 9, who knows how many more weeks to go. So it's also a very different type of event that's really testing our mettle as denizens of New York City. Here's just a quick image. The top dot there you see, that's Dumbo, Brooklyn. That's where my office is. The lower dot there, that's where I live in Clinton Hill in Brooklyn. This is basically my world on any given week. Of course, I do go into Manhattan. I go further afield, in the city. But for the most part, I'm between home and work, and then recreationally out and about in these various neighborhoods with my wife and son, and heading down to Prospect Park or up to, on runs up to Domino Park. And all of this basically over the course of a weekend shrunk down to this scale, right? So that tells you now, besides going out for runs, where our life is condensed to, which is kind of shocking, right? To just feel like you don't have the range and the use of the subway system. Yes.
Mike, I hate to interrupt, but your slides aren't moving forward for anybody else. All that we can see is what's happening now. I've gotten a couple of text messages, so
Oh no. Okay.
FYI.
Okay. Is that working?
Not yet. Try it again.
Yeah. It says sharing is paused. Try this again. Okay, can you see that now?
Yeah. Ashleigh suggested exit full screen mode on PDF. That might. So maybe just keep it like this and not do full screen mode.
Oh, it just dropped back in. Are you seeing it now?
Hit forward. Go forward 1 slide.
There we go. That's forward.
Nope, it's not showing through. So Ashleigh's fixed it. So don't do full screen.
Okay.
Thanks, Ashleigh.
So there you go. So this was the slide in New York City without people. So the opening slide here is the world I described, which is my week to week, and then zoomed in to what we're experiencing now here at the hyper local level. So So this is my neighborhood. You can see, hopefully you can see my cursor, the center dot here. This is our apartment building. We are extremely lucky to be riding out this crisis with so much proximity to essential services. Our grocery store across the street is here. The family that we share childcare with, typically through a nanny, lives over on this block, just 2 blocks away. We've been able to leverage each other's families without our nanny to have 4 adults taking care of 2 kids in a way that's making a lot of sense. That connection, that proximity makes that a very easy thing to do. Our access to food is a local grocery store that is mom and pop and has well-stocked food shelves and has done a really incredible job managing through this crisis. But I will say there's some really key differences in our life as well in terms of where we go for our public space in our town square. And so you can see in this map, the spaces that are outlined in yellow are all the small playgrounds around our neighborhood. We're very fortunate to have this redundancy because we found that our favorite playground, which is this one, Underwood Park, is no longer really viable for families. It's where most people went in the neighborhood. It's got a broad range of things for little kids to do. That's my, at that point, 1-year-old son last summer. It has the best play equipment, the best shade, everything's in the best condition. But what we found through redundancy in the urbanism is not only the great amenity of having proximity to the things that we need most at this time, but that the spaces that we shunned previously have now become a huge amenity. This is another park that's just adjacent to our house on the other side of the block. This is basically a large asphalt patch with a basketball hoop and a handball court. This is where people don't love to go unless they're teaching their kid to ride a bike. But I can tell you now, at this stage of life with kids, having this access where we can spread out, the kids can ride their scooters and their bikes and they can run, has proven to be absolutely critical for our families in terms of just being able to talk to some people from a safe distance and to get the kids out of the house. Without that proximity, without that redundancy in the open space network, I think riding this out would be certainly more challenging. Of course, the reality of the city is that people are really on edge in a lot of ways. And this was a post that I actually saw last night on our neighborhood next door listserv. I won't read through it, but basically people are really concerned with how close, even just walking next to each other has become with the limited space on our sidewalks. Some sidewalks are as narrow as 6 or 7 feet, some as grand as 20, but even so, with the amount of people who are still out and about needing services or going on for a run, this becomes very uncomfortable. And so to zoom back out of New York, I've been studying this for the past week, is how are cities responding to this? And I'd say at a broad level, you're seeing 2 basic responses to the challenge of proximity and the challenges of people being outdoors together. Chicago is an example of being basically cracking down on access, right? They're not permissive. They're being very restrictive in their policy, even closing down trails to public use. Whereas a city like Calgary is much more on the permissive side, where just this past weekend, they started opening up lanes and segments of streets for people to get out and walk, bike, and get some exercise, which is really different in its approach, obviously, and a very different philosophy on how you manage some of the issues that have come up in this last few weeks. Bogota, Colombia, for example, is maybe the shining star at the moment. And that's largely because Bogota has for decades had a program called Ciclovia, which is when every week they shut down more than 70 miles of streets for people to commune in and to get physical activity. This is at a scale that we don't see in the United States, but it's a muscle that they've been able to flex in the last 2 weeks, where they now have 37 miles of streets open to people to use, both for transport, accessing essential jobs and services, but also for recreation. And so for them, is a very easy pivot with their their organization and background to put this out on the street and have it be permanent while we're dealing with this crisis. So that response we've seen a much smaller scale in cities like New York and Calgary. Other cities have taken on the similar approach, but are focusing primarily on parkways, roads that go through large regional parks or adjacent to them, particularly along waterfronts. So there you see Portland, Oregon has closed 7.5 miles of streets to cars to open more space up for people. Minneapolis has done something similar. Montgomery County, Maryland has a creek parkway, which they close on the weekends in the warmer months of the year. That's now open. And Philadelphia, like Bogota, took their open streets route and have opened that more permanently. On the more DIY side of things, here's a neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. There's a physical education teacher named Sam Balto. He's just started printing signs and throwing them on the cones and getting kids outdoors on his block in his neighborhood to be able to get exercise together, and using the very simple infrastructure of the cones and the homemade printed signs to kind of take matters into their own neighborhood's hands. In Berlin, which you see pictured here, the response has been even more biking than you would typically see in Berlin. You can see they've already scarified some of the roadway markings and they've widened the bike lanes to meet the demand and to keep people at a relative safe distance. New York City has a little over a mile of temporary bikeway, largely closing a key gap in the network that's been put into place using just barrels and cones and signs. And Mexico City has done the same. Down to the intersection granular level, you see that a lot of beg buttons, which are clearly not sanitary for people to put their fingers all over, have been done away with in Auckland, Sydney, Adelaide, Cambridge, and Brookline, Mass. This is a growing strategy where pedestrians no longer are forced to hit that button, but the pedestrian signals are on recall so that people can just cross the street without pressing the button. A really interesting, quick response that I think is one very small way to deal with the challenges. As we zoom back out and I think about the strategies and the ways to think about this, what I'm really disappointed in so far with New York and other cities is that they're not leveraging the capacity of those of us who are well at this moment to assist with some of these efforts. There still are a lot of people going to the parks. There is that uncomfortableness on the sidewalks as people walk to the grocery store or to their jobs. And so a really quick protocol that I've been thinking through the last couple of days is that the role of the city in all this could be to map and establish the criteria for the streets that could be appropriately closed and managed at certain hours of the day by business improvement districts, block and condo associations or co-op associations like our own, and nonprofits who have capacity and people who might be able to manage some of the very light infrastructure of keeping these streets open and free for human use. There seems to be a bit of a lack of trust in people to do that. New York has closed a number of street segments, but they have a very, very heavy police presence, which at this time is probably not the best use of those resources. There's no events happening in cities right now. There's no marathons, there's no festivals, there's no block parties. That infrastructure of cones and barricades is in high supply at the moment, and it's ideal for doing these temporary closures to streets, at least at time of day closures. And finally, the fourth step would just be to monitor and allocate police resources effectively. There's a lot of other issues policing to be focused on right now, not just small scale, block closures to let people get some fresh air and walk across the street. If you want to stay informed in some of this, obviously it's evolving fast. Life in New York City is evolving fast right now. We started a spreadsheet that's open source that we've had, lots of people contributing to the last week about what cities are doing and how they're doing them and the scale at which they're doing them. And then I've started a Google photo pool that people can add the images from their own city, so you can really document at this historic time how cities are reacting and managing this crisis. So finally, I'll end with what comes next. What I'm seeing so far with information that we have is that cities, particularly New York, are being hit the hardest right now. I have some grave concerns about how this spreads and when it spreads to more rural and suburban areas. My folks are in rural Maine, so have a very strong concern about the amount of resources that are available and the proximity of people to those resources in a place such as that. I believe that recovery will be fastest in cities. I think it will be fastest in New York, but I think that recovery will possibly exacerbate the inequality and our national political divides even further. Who's being impacted by this the most in New York City are people with the least resources are being forced to be on the subway, head to the hospitals, respond to crises, and are really exposed to this virus, which is a huge concern. And what comes in the wake of that, we don't yet know. I think the concern about density in urban life will be uneven across the country. I had a conversation with some urbanists on Sunday about concerns in Memphis and Louisville, just getting their density and getting over that concern, that conversation, and getting new developments in their downtown cores and walkable areas. And this is going to set that back. And that's very possible. But I think in other locations, this could potentially be a blip. In New York, Philadelphia, other places around the country, you might see this have very little impact on the concern for living urban life, particularly if jobs come back the fastest in these places. And of course, my opinion is that we will absolutely need all of our cities to be thriving if we're going to meet our larger goals about the economy, housing, climate, et cetera. Number three, cities need to be more proactive to deal with this type of pandemic. Most cities have been caught very flat-footed on what to do and how to respond, particularly in the public realm, and not having a protocol or way to manage the demand and potential use of our streets and public spaces in a way that makes sense is something I think will come out of this in the long term. But I also feel like a lot of cities will not learn this lesson, and that'll be unfortunate. And then finally, I think actions taken over the next 4 months will very possibly implicate urban design responses and decisions for the next 40 years. So this is a huge opportunity for urbanists and cities to rebalance street space, to rethink the role of citizens in the city and how to better manage our public spaces and resources for this moment that we need such resiliency, but also for the longer term and midterm challenges and existential threats of things like climate change, and giving people better options and safer options to move around their communities. So I think there's a real silver lining to this, we hope. So with that, I will hand over to Ashleigh Walton, who's in downtown Pittsburgh, who's an architect at UDA. And take it away, Ashleigh.
Awesome, thanks, Mike. So like Mike said, I'm Ashleigh Walton. I'm an architect as well as an urban designer. So I found myself gravitating more towards talking about the built spaces that we find ourselves in during quarantine. So I have some mixed feelings, and I will preface that with two things. One, I grew up in a suburban place that tended much more rural. For context, my mom would drive me every Monday for an hour to the nearest city, Knoxville, Tennessee, which was the big city, so that I could have my violin lessons. And then two, I am an unabashed city lover. 2 months ago, almost 2 months ago, I closed on a condo in a 12-unit building in downtown Pittsburgh that was built in 1892. It's above my favorite Korean restaurant in the city, which of course is now only serving takeout. And my dog Apache and I are following the stay-at-home orders here in Pittsburgh alone, and she very well may walk behind me at any moment and provide a cameo. So I walk her several times a day, which is pretty normal. And on Sunday, I took a great bike ride on the river trail because it was 77 degrees here in Pittsburgh. But I also found that that may be the last time I can do that for a while because the trail was much more crowded than I anticipated. But here's where I get to my mixed feelings. I am an introvert. So the vast majority of quarantine has actually not bothered me at all. But even with my introverted tendencies, I have never once in my beautiful, busy downtown thought that it was too crowded. Not during rush hour, not during massive festivals. Crowds come with loving cities, and that was never a problem. So having that feeling of my river trail feeling too crowded was really difficult for me to comprehend. The Freakonomics podcast, which is a personal favorite of mine, recently had an episode titled, "What Does COVID-19 Mean for Cities and Marriages?" And on the episode, the author, Ed Glacier, who wrote The Triumph of the City, How Our Greatest Invention Makes Us Richer, Smarter, Greener, Healthier, and Happier, talks about the demons that come with density. And one of those demons, he says, is disease. So it seems logical as we watch major population centers straining under increased caseloads and edging towards some of their peaks faster. However, then you have Singapore with significantly higher density than most places in the US and hailed as the gold standard in their COVID-19 response and boasts significantly fewer cases as a result. So clearly it's not necessarily density that's the problem. But if density isn't necessarily the problem, what do we need in the spaces we live in the world that we're in now? As millennials do, I reached out to my friends via several different social media channels and posed two major questions. One, has quarantine made you rethink where you live? About 60% of people who responded said yes. And then two, would you have picked a different neighborhood, house, or apartment if you knew you might be quarantined in it? About a third, 34%-ish of respondents said yes. So obviously this is a not so scientific anecdote, but people who responded in more depth beyond just the poll had all sorts of feelings, from a desire for more space or another bathroom, to a desire for more land, the ability to live off the land, to no feelings at all about indoor spaces as long as they could go outside. There were common themes throughout almost all the respondents, which I thought was really interesting since they varied in age, number of children or lack thereof, marital status, and they were from all over the country. But the three big things that I heard were: one, access to quality outdoor space is a game changer, both public and private. Then two, there's a strong desire for some sort of quiet space, no matter the size of the space you're in. Didn't matter apartment, house, big building, small building, there was a strong desire for some sort of quiet space. And then three, this one will probably surge in importance in the future of design, there needs to be dedicated space in the house for work activities. And this can be any size or type of space. This can link back to number two and is not necessarily an entire room. So one of the things that I've read the most in a lot of my internet musings on this topic are phrases like, I bet they're regretting those micro units now, and I sure bet they hate that open floor plan. But what these responses were starting to show me is that we can start to think about the architecture so crucial to urbanism with the earliest scratch marks of a roadmap. So number one, prioritize an increase in quality, accessible outdoor space, both public and private. Number two, design for acoustical privacy, both inside and out. And three, focus on design that allows for dedicated space and activities at a variety of scales. So why the increase in outdoor space? This doesn't just mean bigger parks. It means outdoor spaces of all scales. The balcony, the terrace, the well-maintained sidewalk, the pocket park, the trail, the neighborhood park, and the regional park all have a role to play. So this variety of scales gives options so that entire communities don't resort to their only outdoor space, like a single park or a single trail that becomes quickly overwhelmed. What I'm hearing from people my age and all over was just the fact that having those options, having an outdoor option, completely flipped the paradigm about how they felt about these places that they lived. So then we can talk about design for acoustical privacy. Pay attention to construction, to window orientation, but also how building form and placement affects acoustical privacy for residents, for office workers, for whoever. We can think about how buildings are being used and when they're being used. So if residences are mostly full at night and offices are mostly full during the day. We can use low walls, landscaping, and other features to make a wider variety of outdoor space more acoustically private, indoor space too. We can also create outdoor rooms and give people quiet spaces that are both inside and outside. So to allow for dedicated spaces inside homes. So this doesn't mean singular uses like a dedicated home office room, but simply dedicated space. So an area under the stairs that was a closet could become a desk area, or a deep window ledge can house more storage. Nooks can be designed to be either closets and or offices. There are a huge range of possibilities. So we think about these spaces that we design and we can piece them all together into this fabric of urbanism for a rapidly changing world. And we can focus on these little pieces, these little incremental pieces. What people have asked me quite a bit, especially since I closed on a condo in downtown Pittsburgh 2 months ago, is, do you regret living downtown? Like, is living downtown strange or different? And it is really strange. I mean, a lot like Mike's pictures of New York right now. I've never seen downtown Pittsburgh so empty. I mean, I've never seen it like this before. But because of what it is and where it is, I also find myself to still be able to have some level of human interaction in my day-to-day activities with Apache. I can go for a walk and still say hi to neighbors. I actually, the servers at Bebe's Kitchen, my favorite Korean restaurant downstairs, often ask us how we're holding up or how we're doing as they're disinfecting the front door handles of their space. And it allows for a level of neighborliness and camaraderie that I don't know if I could get in the neighborhood where I grew up in East Tennessee. So it's an interesting picture of, do I have any issues or problems with where I've chosen to live and where I've chosen to purchase? Not at all. I would take downtown Pittsburgh again in a heartbeat any day. And from what I'm hearing from a lot of my friends, I think they would pick where they're choosing to live too. And some of them actually said they wish they lived in a place that was more walkable and bikeable. I have sirens in the background. But that is what I'm understanding in this roadmap, is that we can create these pieces, create a picture for the future of this urban and suburban and rural life that we find ourselves in. So now I'll turn it back over to Lynn to moderate the Q&A.
Oh my gosh, Ashleigh, thank you so much. And thank you, Laurie, Seth, and Mike. I just love the different ways everyone addressed the question. Technical, logistical, practical, philosophical. So I'd also like to remind the listeners to pose questions through your Q&A button that's on the bottom of the screen. Most people have been doing it already. So Seth, the first question goes to you. Are there any new trends you are specifically seeing or predicting in new urbanist town centers that may offer lessons for retaining vibrancy and resiliency as we move forward with our work? So that's kind of emerging trends. Do you want me to read that again? I think you're muted, Seth, on your phone.
Thank you for reminding me. I was actually sort of very impressed with Mike and Ashleigh's response, kind of bringing context to my observations here. And what was interesting is looking at Mike's neighborhood on the screen, how much it looked like downtown Frederick and many of the new urbanist communities in and around Washington, D.C. So I was very much reassured by their experience living in the neighborhood, their access to these smaller and numerous independent-owned businesses, pocket parks, and so forth and so on. And the terms that he used, which resonated in with my presentation as well, which is adaptability and redundancy. And I think that when I visited some of the new urbanist communities in and around DC, I saw evidence of that. Right now, it's kind of almost a tradition, kind of in a transition between a hybrid transition between full density and this sort of kind of suburban market context. And so the difference, I think, between those new urbanist communities, say, and Mike's neighborhood is just the scale of the urban fabric. So I think right now, what I'm seeing in terms of the commercial areas, they're getting much better at emulating the value and the walkability and the connectivity of traditional urbanism. And as those start to weave together into a larger context, I think you're going to start to see that becoming a much more powerful and compelling aspect. So the only other trend, and I think this is really kind of going to be a counter to some of the other trends that had been starting to manifest themselves in the urban centers, like this notion of ghost kitchens and ghost grocery stores, which are really just to facilitate this online delivery thing. And I'm really hoping that we may have tested the limits of this virtual commerce model in this outcome and reasserted or reinforced the value of true urbanism from a systemic level.
Thanks, Seth. I have often been saying that in every crisis there's an opportunity. And Mike, I was really interested to see your slides and how places all over the country are really maximizing and increasing their active space, their public realm, right? So is there, and this question was mine and then someone else asked it as well, do you see a rise in placemaking efforts once the virus is mitigated, or do you see at the same time, do you see some of these, like the bike lane in Germany being twice as wide? Do you see some of these just continuing because we've educated, now educated is not the right word, but people are craving this more space and they're enjoying it. So what do you see happening with placemaking post-pandemic?
That's a great question. I really appreciate you and the other viewer asking that question. I think it's going to be really important for communities that already have existing placemaking infrastructure. So whether that's movies in the park, it's the farmers market, it's coming together in some way that all is the first thing that can come back in the public realm, and establishing that right off the bat is going to be critical for people feeling like there's normalcy that's back and feeling trust with each other and trust in the public realm. That can then be, I think, a launching pad for additional efforts and more placemaking, but also I think further embedding the spatial gains that we're seeing at a very small increment. I would definitely underscore that I'm happy to see cities doing this. It's not enough. They're not being, aggressive enough in the space that they could be taking right now, and reallocating that for larger use. Because once it's there, I don't think the Second Avenue, protected bikeway gap in Manhattan, they're not going to take away that infrastructure and make the gap come back again. That's just not going to be a thing that happens. And so that at large, yes, the German bike lane, I would be surprised if it goes back to being the normal width. So this is the time to act and to move both from a placemaking, but also a spatial allocation perspective. And I think the social demands we're going to have to be with each other again, to connect, to be in our parks and public places is going to be so strong that can then definitely be a springboard to more of this activity. And that's what I'm really excited to see.
And I have a comment on that too. Like, just to build off what Mike was saying, was just what I saw when I was on my bike ride on Sunday is that what I'm seeing is people falling back in love with their places. And some of that is just the natural thing that always happens with spring, and people remember they like their parks. But part of it, I really do think, is just when everything else was stripped away, I do think people are going to have a certain sense of appreciation for these spaces, some of which they may have not known existed. I mean, one of my favorite trails to bike on is the head of the Ohio River Trail, which is a little further up past the North Shore in Pittsburgh. And I'm almost always the only person on there when I'm biking. And now I saw so many people that we actually had to pay attention to who was passing and when. And that, I think, is something I think some people are discovering outdoor places for the first time in their cities. So I hope it leads to a rise in people doing that.
Laurie?
I would like to just add a bit. I'm not an architect or a planner, but one thing I absolutely think is going to be happening in so many of the small cities that don't have the resources that the larger cities do to start with, is that it's almost like we're going to have to start all over again. And placemaking is what we used to bring back those cities originally. And I think we're just going to have to work even harder at the same practices that we've been doing all along to bring those cities back to where they were 3 months ago. We don't have to relearn the tools. We just have to be more vigilant about applying them.
So Laurie, can you amplify that? So how do we prepare our most vulnerable cities and neighborhoods, the ones that are already struggling to work in a post, pandemic era? So that question came in from Dan Bisden, who works on legacy cities in the Midwest. But you kind of mentioned it, but it just feels like this is something all of you might want to comment on.
Me first? Okay. Okay. Well, it's really interesting because we do a lot of our work in these small cities that never make the national headlines, and they have been struggling probably to a greater extent than the larger cities to make their housing affordable, to make the kinds of stores and shops that are available open to everyone. And as they are all closed up now, everyone is wondering, how are they going to react when we're able to have open shops again? And I think that given the fact that we don't know when this is going to happen, how long it will be, how long these restaurants and stores will be closed, how many will go out of business, is of huge concern. But I know that all of these towns are absolutely dedicated to the idea that when it comes back, when life comes back to their downtowns, that affordable housing will definitely be a key part of what they plan to do to make downtowns not just for wealthy people, but for everybody who is part of the city.
Any other comments from folks? We've got a bunch of different questions coming in on inequities between areas, looking at will the informal communities be hit more? Will public housing areas be hit more? This kind of, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick comment on that here in New York City. We actually are, the few maps that have been produced that have seen on where the virus is spreading the fastest and having the worst impact, they're actually the lower density areas of the city. They're the outer boroughs, they're off the subway lines, they're places where people are largely living who are servicing the hyper economy of Manhattan and inner Brooklyn and Queens, right? So those of us in the inner part of the city, the denser part of the city, the wealthier part of the city is faring better so far. And it's the lower density areas that are struggling. So it's kind of a commentary on both the density question, but also, the equity question, because these neighborhoods which are on the periphery, might have the stores that don't come back at all and yield more available space, or the housing units that go into disrepair. And that gives me concern that very quickly they become the target of gentrification efforts and investment schemes that can be pretty pernicious in terms of keeping a class of people engaged with the city and engaged with employment that makes this whole city work. And so that is a lot of different types of workers, but right now it's the healthcare workers that are at the front lines of that. And many of them, with the salaries they earn, are living more on the periphery than in the core.
I can also speak to here in Pittsburgh, something that I have absolutely noticed that can't be overlooked in my downtown is most of the people I see on the street now, if I see people on the river trail, it is a mix of individuals. If I see people who are still on the bus or still walking to get to work, they are Black like me. That is what I am seeing. I'm seeing more Black people in downtown Pittsburgh now than I did when things were normal. So I think that is something that also can't be overstated, that there is a lot of really clear inequalities on who these essential workers are who are going to work and who are putting themselves and their families in quite a bit of risk for the only options that they have.
Thanks. This conversation has been great, but it's also slightly depressing. It's more than slightly depressing. A question from Roseanne. I would like to know what collaborative efforts other new urbanist town centers are doing to assist local businesses. I've been impressed with the elegance and scalability of the online Crested Butte chip jar, looking to replicate this in a new urbanist community. So we go from inequities to Crested Boots. Seth, Laurie, Mike, do you guys have any, Ashleigh, any thoughts on that?
Well, one theoretical advantage that new urbanist town centers have, or commercial districts, is unified comprehensive management, and therefore the ability to sort of kind of manage the impacts of that at more of a systemic level. So I am hoping they're taking advantage of that. It's almost, again, sort of the best of both worlds, having the appeal of smaller, unique, independent merchants, but also the ability to kind of leverage those things. Interestingly enough, the mall near closest to me is closed, and they're suffering with a lot of the same issues. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see, how that particular question is managed relative to, sort of more traditional organic commercial districts. But I think that there's the community support aspect of it is absolutely critical.
Seth, back in the early days of these new urbanist town centers, it was often the task of the developer or the owner of the land or the owner of the projects in these town centers to actually provide the space that these shops and stores were to occupy at either no rent or very low rent. Do you think we will be doing that again in order to get life back into these town centers?
I think certainly the more enlightened developers and property managers will take that approach, because I think it's in everybody's best interest. I think when you're dealing with more of an organic downtown, you're going to have to see a variety of different tools and mechanisms, low interest loans or outright grants, and or these kind of crowdsourcing initiatives like the tip jar. But my impression is that there's a much closer bond and sense of community between the smaller independent businesses and the national chains. So they each kind of have something to offer, but in terms of community support, just like Mike was talking about, his ability to access essential needs right there within walking distance of his front door. I think they're going to see that as more of an integral part of the value of urban living and do more to support it as part of their critical ecosystem.
Mike, final question for you, which is really easy. A number of people have asked both for your slides and for the Google Doc where they can contribute to your photo gallery. Would you be willing to share those after and have us post it on our website?
Yeah, of course. And inside of the presentation are the links to both, so you can just copy them into your browser. But absolutely.
All right. Last, we're going to run a minute or two over, but last opportunity for our 4 panelists to offer any closing thoughts on this, on our topic today.
I've got one quick comment. I was just, the question of density. I was really struck by how much open space was created by just getting all of those automobiles off the road and out of the equation. And so I think it really calls into the question from a land use point of view, really whether it's an issue of density or how that density is used.
Ashleigh, Mike, Laurie, any closing thoughts?
Well, I see a question from Jim that I think is a very interesting one, because it gets beyond where we are in terms of urbanism and what new urbanists can do. But the question was, do you think towns and cities should develop some sort of resiliency plan for future emergencies or pandemics? Seems like they have never taken it seriously. And that's absolutely the case. I hope this is a wake-up call, but Hurricane Sandy came. Hurricanes have devastated, and we still go on oblivious. I think if nothing else, we should realize that our world is changing by more than pandemics, climate change, and we really do have to learn how to make our living environments more adaptable to the unknown unknowns.
Thank you, Laurie.
And to that point, if your city doesn't have a way to leverage low-cost, quick resources to make do with what's available to meet the challenge of the day, then your city should probably think that through. And this is something that we've only been able to achieve as a firm for our company in about 5 or 6 places, in terms of really putting in a policy and a program in place so you could leverage that. A Bogota or Philadelphia, where there is programs already at play for the good times, have turned out to be really, really critical infrastructure for the bad times. So I would definitely, at whatever level or community you're in fact, in the smaller community, sometimes it's even easier bureaucratically to do these things. Think about that and how you can leverage that for the most positive outcome possible through this pandemic, but also in whatever comes next.
For my closing comments, I liked this one question from San Paulo, which was, is there anything to be learned from the Asian response, from Asian cities' response? And I think there are a lot of things to be learned from the Asian cities' responses, but I think one of the biggest ones is a coordinated response with an emphasis on peace of mind. So one of the major things was making it really aware to individuals who were quarantined that your treatment was free, your testing was provided, your necessities would be taken care of while everything was going on. And because of the benefits and challenges behind the fact that we are a nation with really strong state governments and really strong municipal governments and a really strong federal government that all have their own priorities and conflicting tensions, is a challenge, especially since you end up with municipal governments that are much stronger than others, that have bigger play and can elbow their way into things, and you have states with more coordinated responses, and you have a very American individualistic country, which is a wonderful thing. But it's looking at, so what do we do, to Laurie's point earlier, how do we start putting plans in place that are scalable for smaller municipalities and scalable for a larger coordinated federal response?
And directly address the inequities that we're seeing really emerge right now.
Exactly. So the big question will be, will we learn from this? I mean, I hope so. But when you look at the fact that the last massive pandemic was 100 years ago, and did we learn stuff from that? Yeah, I think we did. I think one of the biggest things that has changed from 1918 Spanish flu pandemic to today is that within weeks of it initially being discovered, the entire RNA sequence for the coronavirus was published for anyone who wanted to do further research on it. So like even just where we've advanced in science, I think can give us some lessons learned. But when we look at what we can do from a placemaking and cities perspective, it's trying to coordinate resiliency efforts, which I think has become a larger part of many of our practices, is looking at resiliency for all sorts of things.
Oh my gosh, I have a huge amount of gratitude and thanks to all of our panelists, to the number of people who listened in and asked questions. So thank you all for joining us today. We will have a second edition of the On the Park Bench next week, featuring Victor Dover and one of his local government partners, talking about how you do a virtual charrette and what are virtual ways of public engagement. And it goes directly to this equity question. So again, looking at how there are, you know, how we can make some lemonade out of these lemons. So thank you all. We'll be posting the webinar within 24 hours on our website, and looking forward to seeing many of you next week. And panelists, huge, huge thank you. All right, have a good afternoon, everyone, and stay safe.